Everyone's heard of the boys' anti-tank rifle. Most people who have heard of it remember it the same way. A desperate weapon, a last resort, a piece of kit that soldiers dragged into battle because there was nothing better available, and then quietly abandoned the moment something better came along. And honestly, that reputation isn't entirely wrong. By the time the Second World War hit its stride, the boys was already being called obsolete. The tanks it was designed to defeat had grown thicker skins, and the rifle's punch just wasn't enough anymore. But here's the thing that almost nobody talks about. While the boys was losing its fight against tanks, it was winning something else entirely. Something nobody expected. It was punching through walls, engine blocks, light vehicles, aircraft on the ground, and fortified positions that stopped everything else cold. It was doing things in places like the North African desert, the frozen Finnish wilderness, the Pacific jungles, and the cramped streets of occupied Europe that no one had designed it to do, and almost no one had predicted it could. And then there was one specific moment, one specific target, where the boys' anti-tank rifle didn't just perform, it shocked everyone who witnessed it, where it pierced something that heavier, more expensive, more celebrated weapons had failed to scratch. That story almost never gets told. And the story of how the boys got there, of the man who created it, the army that nearly rejected it, the soldiers who carried it across impossible terrain while calling it every name in the book, that story is even better. So if you're not subscribed yet, do it now, because this is the kind of history that gets buried under the headline weapons. The kind where the supposedly clumsy, supposedly outdated, supposedly second-rate tool turns out to have a chapter in its story that nobody saw coming. This is the full history of the boys' anti-tank rifle. And it starts not with a genius invention, but with a problem that nobody knew how to solve. The year is 1934, and the British Army is having an argument with itself. The argument, like most military arguments, sounds simple on the surface and turns out to be enormously complicated once you start pulling at the threads. The question being debated is this: how do you stop a tank? Not a massive tank, not a future tank, not the steel monsters that would eventually roll across Europe in 1940. Just a tank, the kind that existed in 1934. Light armor, modest speed, mostly used for infantry support. The kind every major European power was either already building or had clear plans to build very soon. The British Army looked at what they had available to stop such a thing, and the answer was not encouraging. They had artillery, obviously, but artillery required crews, transport, positioning, and setup time. It was not a solution you could hand to a section of infantry and tell them to carry it up a hill. They had grenades, which required getting close enough to a moving armored vehicle to throw one accurately, which was essentially a death sentence against anything with a machine gun mounted on it. They had anti-tank mines, which required knowing in advance exactly where the tank was going to drive, which the tanks generally declined to cooperate with. And they had nothing else, nothing that a single soldier or a small team could carry, set up quickly, and use to kill an armored vehicle at a useful range. The gap was obvious, the solution was not. What the Army wanted was something a two-man team could carry, something that could defeat the armor of current light tanks, which in 1934 typically meant somewhere between 9 and 14 millimeters of face-hardened steel at combat ranges. Something that had enough range to keep the crew alive while they used it. And something that didn't weigh so much that simply transporting it to the battlefield constituted a military operation in itself. The British Small Arms Committee began looking at options. One of the people who took that requirement seriously was a man named Captain H.C. Boys. And this is where the story gets interesting, because Boys wasn't some celebrated armaments genius with a string of famous designs behind him. He was a staff officer at the Small Arms Committee, a practical man, an engineer by temperament, if not always by formal training. Someone who looked at problems and tried to solve them, rather than waiting for someone with more impressive credentials to handle it. Boys had been working on various small arms developments for years. He understood what rifles could and couldn't do. He understood the relationship between bullet weight, velocity, and penetration. And he understood something that a lot of people in the debate about anti-tank weapons seem to overlook, which was that the simplest solution, a very large, very fast bullet fired from a weapon a man could actually carry, might actually work if you designed it right. The concept wasn't new. The idea of a large caliber rifle as an anti-tank weapon had actually been proven in the First World War, where the Germans had fielded the Mauser Tankgewehr, a 13mm single-shot rifle that was brutal to fire and only marginally effective, but did demonstrate the basic principle. Boys had studied that weapon and its limitations. He knew it was clumsy, impractical, and hard on the shooter to a degree that bordered on self-inflicted injury. But he also knew it worked, and he believed that with better design, better ammunition, and better engineering, you could produce something that was actually usable. So boys began developing a weapon around a 55 caliber cartridge, half an inch in diameter, fired at extremely high velocity. The bullet itself was a hardened steel projectile, designed not just to hit armor, but to defeat it, to punch through the face-hardened steel of contemporary light tanks and put enough energy through the other side to destroy whatever it found there. Engines, ammunition, crew. The rifle he designed around this cartridge was large, obviously. There was no way around that. The cartridge demanded a certain minimum size and weight in the weapon, just to manage the recoil forces involved. But boys worked to minimize everything that could be minimized. The design incorporated a muzzle brake, which was essentially a device fitted to the end of the barrel that redirected propellant gases to push back against the weapon's recoil, rather than letting all of that force translate directly into the shooter's shoulder. He added a monopod under the stock, a single folding leg at the rear that let the weapon rest on the ground and absorb some recoil into the earth. He added a bipod near the muzzle. He designed a detachable 5-round box magazine. He built the barrel so it could slide slightly within the receiver on firing, another recoil mitigation measure. He added a large rubber recoil pad to the butt. He tried, in short, to take a weapon that was inherently going to hit the shooter like a freight train and build enough engineering into it that the freight train arrived as a very firm push rather than a structural injury. The result was a rifle approximately 5 feet 3 inches long, weighing just under 36 pounds when empty, with a bore diameter of 0.55 inches and a muzzle velocity, depending on the specific ammunition used, of somewhere between 2,400 and 2,700 feet per second. It was a large weapon. There was no getting around that. It was heavy. It required a 2-man crew in practice, one to carry and operate it, one to help carry the ammunition and assist with reloading and spotting. It was not something you casually shouldered and took for a stroll, but it worked. The penetration figures from early testing were genuinely impressive for the era. The boy's rifle could defeat over 20 millimeters of armor plate at 300 yards and showed usable penetration against lighter armor at ranges approaching 500 yards. Against the light tanks that existed in 1934, 1935, and 1936, these were serious numbers. Enough to threaten the hulls and turrets of the vehicles that potential enemies were actually fielding. The Small Arms Committee evaluated the design. They had reservations. The weapon was bulky and heavy. Moving it around the battlefield would require dedicated effort. The recoil, even with all of Boy's mitigation measures, was substantial and would be punishing to use in extended engagements. There were questions about how useful the magazine capacity was in practice, since 5 rounds was not a lot in a firefight even if you were shooting at tanks. But the penetration worked. The design was practical, and there was literally nothing else available that met the requirement. The weapon was accepted for service. And then, in a somewhat poignant moment that history has preserved, almost exactly as the design was finalized and production was being arranged, Captain H.C. Boys died. He had worked on the rifle for years, shepherded it through development, fought for it through the evaluation process, and he never saw it enter service. The weapon was named after him posthumously, the Boys anti-tank rifle. And it entered British service in 1937 with a designation, an official role, and a set of capabilities that made it genuinely credible against contemporary threats. The problem, as everyone would eventually discover, was that the threats were not going to stay contemporary. To understand what happened to the boys when the war actually started, you need to understand how fast tank armor was evolving in the late 1930s. Because the gap between what the boys was designed to defeat and what it actually had to fight when real combat began was not a small gap. It was a chasm, and it opened up almost immediately. The light tanks of the early to mid-1930s, the ones the boys was designed against, carried armor ranging from roughly 9 to 14 millimeters. Vehicles like the early German Panzer I and Panzer II, which were the primary German tank types when Boys was being developed, sat right in that range. Against those vehicles, the Boys was credible. But by the time actual fighting started in earnest in 1939 and 1940, the Germans were fielding improved versions of their tanks with more armor. The Panzer III and Panzer IV, which formed the backbone of the German armored force in France and the early Eastern Front campaigns, carried frontal armor of 30 millimeters or more. Some were receiving additional applique armor plates bolted on, pushing effective frontal protection significantly higher. Against 30 millimeters of well-angled face-hardened steel, the boy's rifle was struggling. Against additional applique plates on top of that, it was essentially useless against frontal aspects. And it was getting worse. By 1941, the Germans were up-armoring continuously. By 1942, fighting a Panzer IV with a boy's anti-tank rifle was like trying to stop a lorry with a cricket bat. It was brave, it was desperate, and it was not going to work. The British soldiers who carried the boy's rifle into France in 1940 came back with mixed reports that essentially validated every pessimistic prediction, while simultaneously discovering something the development team hadn't fully anticipated. The boys was indeed losing the anti-tank fight against heavier German armor, but against everything lighter than a main battle tank, it was absolutely devastating. German armored cars, of which there were many in the Wehrmacht's arsenal, were being stopped cold by boys' fire. Half-tracked personnel carriers were vulnerable. The lightly armored support vehicles that German units depended on for logistics and communication were being knocked out at ranges that gave boys' crews a meaningful survival margin. And this was not a minor observation. In the kind of fluid, fast-moving battle that France had become, armored cars and half-tracks weren't peripheral targets. They were central to how the Germans operated. Destroying them disrupted communications, stalled logistics, isolated units, and created exactly the kind of chaos that fighting withdrawal operations depended on. So the boys was failing at its primary mission, while succeeding magnificently at missions nobody had bothered to define, and the soldiers using it were making adjustments accordingly. This pattern, where a weapon designed for one purpose finds its actual utility elsewhere, was going to define the boys for the rest of the war. And nowhere was it more clearly demonstrated than in the theaters, where the boys actually continued to be used aggressively long after it was theoretically obsolete. The Western Desert, North Africa, 1941-1942. If there is one place in the entire Second World War where the boys' anti-tank rifle found something close to a second life, a different kind of redemption, it is here. The Desert War was not like the European War. It was not like the Pacific War, or the Eastern Front, or the Italian campaign. It had its own peculiar logic, its own strange rules, and a cast of units that operated in ways that standard military doctrine would have considered somewhere between unorthodox and completely insane. The Long-Range Desert Group, the Special Air Service in its original form under David Sterling. Various special reconnaissance units operating deep behind German and Italian lines. These were not standard infantry formations. They were small, mobile, self-sufficient, operating hundreds of miles from the nearest friendly unit, with nothing but their vehicles, their weapons, and their ability to improvise. And the boys' anti-tank rifle fit into this world in a way that nobody in the development committee in 1934 had ever anticipated. The reason was simple. These units weren't attacking tanks. They were attacking airfields, supply dumps, parked aircraft, fuel stores, radio installations, vehicle parks, communication infrastructure, the kind of soft targets, or relatively soft targets, that a large-caliber, high-velocity rifle could devastate. Consider what happens when you fire a boys' round into an aircraft parked on the ground. Parked aircraft are not armored. They're built for weight savings, not protection. A boys' round does not just put a hole in an aircraft. It tears through engine cowlings, destroys fuel systems, punches through cockpit glazing, and generally renders the aircraft unserviceable with one or two well-placed shots. The Alert-G and SAS Raiders conducting those legendary airfield strikes in 1941 and 1942, the ones that destroyed dozens, eventually hundreds of Axis aircraft on the ground, were using boys' rifles as part of their weapon mix. When you're a small team in jeeps who has just penetrated several hundred miles of desert to attack an enemy airfield, you cannot carry heavy weapons. You need things that are man-portable, reliable in extreme heat and dust, and effective against the specific things you're trying to destroy. The boys worked. It punched through fuel tanks at ranges where the crew could work quickly and withdraw. It disabled parked aircraft before the defenses could properly respond. It destroyed vehicles in the dispersal areas around airfields that might otherwise have been used in the pursuit. David Sterling himself recognized the weapon's value for this specific application. The original SAS Jeeps mounted not just twin Vickers K guns, which were the primary offensive weapons, but also carried Boys rifles for use against harder targets. When you needed to guarantee that an aircraft was destroyed, not just damaged, you put a Boys round through its engine. When you encountered a lightly armored vehicle that the Vickers K guns would struggle with, you reached for the Boys. This was not the role it was designed for, but it was a role that demonstrated something important about the weapon. It had characteristics that were genuinely useful when the target set was right. High velocity, good penetration against light protection, a round that carried enough energy to cause catastrophic damage to unarmored or lightly armored equipment. The problem in Europe and on the conventional battlefield was the target set was wrong. The targets were too heavy. But in the desert, raiding at night against aircraft and fuel and supply infrastructure, the Boys was often exactly the right tool. The same pattern appeared, in somewhat different form, in the Finnish theater. The Winter War between Finland and the Soviet Union ran from November 1939 to March 1940. Finland had Boys anti-tank rifles supplied by Britain, and they used them in conditions that were about as far from the North African desert as it is possible to get. Deep snow, brutal cold, dense forest, the kind of terrain where Soviet tanks couldn't move freely, and Finnish ski troops could appear, strike, and vanish before a conventional response could be organized. The Finnish experience with the Boys was instructive. Against the Soviet Union's light tanks, particularly the T-26 and the various BT series vehicles that formed a large portion of Soviet armor in 1939 and 1940, the Boys was effective. These vehicles carried armor comparable to what the Boys had been designed against, and they discovered what the British had known in testing. A Boys round at combat range defeats that armor. Finnish anti-tank teams operating in the forests around places like Suma and Kola were stopping Soviet light tank attacks with Boys rifles. They were using the weapon as designed, in the role it was created for, against the target type it could actually defeat. And it worked. The catch was the same catch that kept coming up everywhere. When the Soviets brought up their heavier armor, the T-28s and the earliest T-34s, and the KV-1s that appeared toward the end of the Winter War, the Boys was finished as an anti-tank weapon. But that distinction, light tank effective, heavy tank ineffective, was at least honest. The Boys wasn't useless, it was limited. And limitation is very different from uselessness if you understand it clearly and use the weapon accordingly. Now let's talk about the Pacific, because the Pacific theater of the Second World War is where the Boys anti-tank rifle had what might be its most interesting, its most counterintuitive, and its most genuinely impressive chapter. And it starts with a fact about Japanese armor that most people in the Western popular conception of the Second World War don't fully appreciate. Japan's tank force was not built to the same standards as Germany's or the Soviet Union's. Japanese armored vehicles were designed with a different operational philosophy in mind. Japan's strategic priorities through most of the Pacific War involved operations in terrain where heavy tanks were simply impractical. Dense jungle, island environments, limited infrastructure. Japanese armor was optimized for infantry support in those conditions, which meant it was light. The principal Japanese tanks encountered by Commonwealth and American forces in the early years of the Pacific War, the Type 94, the Type 97 Takei, and the most common vehicle, the Type 97 Chiha, in its various forms, carried armor that ranged from roughly 12 to 25 millimeters. Some of the earlier types were even lighter than that. Some of the later Chiha variants had slightly more. But the average figure for Japanese armor in the early to mid-Pacific War was substantially thinner than what German tanks were carrying by 1941, which meant that the Boys anti-tank rifle, already being written off in Europe as dangerously obsolete, was technically still capable against some of the most common armored vehicles it would actually face. Australian forces in particular made extensive use of the Boys in the early Pacific campaigns. At Malaya and Singapore in 1941 and 1942, at New Guinea from 1942 onward, Boys rifles were being used against Japanese armored vehicles and achieving results that would have shocked anyone who had dismissed the weapon based purely on its European performance. There are documented accounts of Boys rifles defeating Japanese tanks at combat ranges in the jungle, fighting around Kokoda and the Papuan beaches. The terrain in those engagements was nothing like the open desert or the rolling hills of France. The jungle reduced engagement ranges dramatically. A tank might emerge from dense vegetation at 50 yards. At those ranges, a Boys rifle firing the right ammunition against Japanese armor was not just marginally effective, it was reliably effective. The combination of close range, thin Japanese armor, and the boys' penetration capability produced results that genuinely saved positions and lives. Now here is the part that almost nobody knows. Here is the part that makes this story worth telling in full. There was a specific engagement type in the Pacific Campaign where the boys' anti-tank rifle didn't just hold its own, it outperformed everything else available. And that engagement type was what military terminology calls direct fire against bunkers and field fortifications. The Japanese defensive doctrine throughout the Pacific was built around fortification. When Japanese forces were defending an island, a beach, a ridge, a river crossing, they did not hold positions in the open. They built bunkers, log bunkers reinforced with earth, coral and concrete bunkers where materials were available, interconnected tunnel systems on the larger islands, field positions reinforced with whatever the terrain provided. These fortifications were a nightmare for attacking infantry. The standard weapons that infantry carried, rifles and light machine guns and submachine guns, could keep the defenders' heads down, but they could not put rounds through the walls of a properly constructed bunker. Grenades could clear a position if you could get close enough to throw them in, but getting close enough meant crossing ground swept by fire from that bunker and every other position covering it. What attacking infantry needed was something that could reach out from a distance and punch through the walls of the fortification. Something that could put a round not just near the bunker, but through the bunker. The anti-tank rifles available to Allied forces included the American M1 bazooka, which fired a rocket-propelled heat warhead and was excellent against tanks but was not what you'd call a precision weapon at extended range, and was affected significantly by wind. There were various artillery solutions, mortars and field guns, but calling in artillery on a position 20 yards ahead of your own troops had obvious risks and wasn't always available in the dense terrain of Pacific fighting. And then there was the boys, because the boys' morting, 55 caliber projectile, fired at high velocity, did something remarkable when it hit the kind of construction Japanese bunkers were typically built from. Log and earth construction, the most common Japanese fortification type, is actually quite vulnerable to high-velocity penetrators. Not because logs and earth don't stop bullets. They do. Conventional rifle rounds don't penetrate meaningful log construction, but the boys' round, with its hardened steel core, its high sectional density, and its velocity, was not a conventional rifle round. It was a round designed to punch through steel. And wood, even heavy reinforced log construction, is significantly softer than face-hardened steel. Boys' rounds were punching through the front walls of Japanese log bunkers at combat ranges. The round was going in one side and coming out the other, or fragmenting inside the structure in a way that was lethal to anyone sheltering behind the logs. This was the specific target change that made all the difference. When the target shifted from German tanks, which were now too heavily armored, to Japanese bunkers, which were not armored at all but were specifically resistant to the weapons everyone else was carrying, the boys' capabilities became uniquely relevant. It was not doing anything it hadn't always been able to do. It had always been able to punch through 30+ millimeters of steel. Wood was not steel. Wood was, in the relevant sense, much softer. But the other weapons in the infantry's arsenal, the weapons that had made the boys look redundant in the anti-tank role, couldn't do this either. The Lee Enfield rifle of a British or Australian infantryman fired a rimmed .3303 caliber cartridge at around 2,440 feet per second. It would penetrate some inches of wood, not through a bunker wall. The Bren gun fired the same cartridge faster, same limitation. The Thompson submachine gun fired a pistol cartridge. It was not penetrating anything. Even the anti-tank weapons that had superseded the boys in Europe, the Piat projector, which fired a shape-charge bomb at relatively low velocity, was designed to defeat armor through chemical energy, not kinetic penetration. Its round might defeat the bunker if it detonated properly, but it was a contact-fuzzed weapon with limited precision and significant minimum range requirements. The boys was different. It was a direct-fire kinetic weapon firing a high-velocity penetrating round, and against Japanese bunker construction, it was uniquely suited to the mission. Australian soldiers in New Guinea and later in the island-hopping campaigns developed tactics specifically around this capability. A boys' team would take up a covered firing position, often from distances that put them safely outside the effective range of the Japanese defenders' rifles. They would put multiple rounds through the front wall of the fortification. The rounds would penetrate, fragment, and create lethal conditions inside the bunker, or the penetrations would open gaps that reduced the protection for the defenders. or simply the psychological effect of knowing that the cover they were sheltering behind was not actually stopping what was being fired at them, was enough to force movement, which then exposed the defenders to the other weapons covering the position. British forces in Burma used the boys in similar ways. The jungle fighting in the Arakan, the brutal campaigns around Imphal and Kohima involved repeated assaults on prepared Japanese defensive positions. The boys appeared in accounts from those engagements used specifically against fortified positions and bunkers, where its penetration capability made it uniquely valuable. There is a level of military irony here that is genuinely satisfying. The boys' anti-tank rifle was declared obsolete as an anti-tank weapon almost as soon as the war properly started. The tanks had simply gotten too heavy, and that verdict was correct. Against German armor in Europe, against medium and heavy tanks anywhere, the boys was not a solution. But the characteristics that made it a credible anti-tank weapon, the high velocity, the hardened steel projectile, the penetration capability, those characteristics didn't disappear just because tanks had gotten thicker. They were still there, waiting for the right target. And in the Pacific, they found it. Let's talk about the weapon itself in more physical detail, because part of the boys' story is the experience of actually using it. Because the soldiers who carried and fired it had opinions about it, and those opinions were not gentle. The rifle was 36 pounds unloaded, and the .55 caliber boys cartridge itself was a substantial round. The magazine held 5 rounds. In sustained use, an anti-tank rifle section could burn through ammunition quickly, and that ammunition was heavy and bulky. The muzzle brake was effective at reducing felt recoil, but effective is a relative term when you are talking about a rifle designed to defeat armored vehicles. Every person who has written about firing the boys describes the experience as, at best, firm, and at worst, genuinely painful. The rifle had a tendency, particularly if the shooter wasn't positioned perfectly, to transmit recoil in ways that could cause bruising, shoulder injuries, and in cases where the technique was poor, more serious trauma. The muzzle blast was dramatic and loud. In confined spaces, firing a boys was an assault on every sense at once. The monopod at the rear was useful for the initial setup, but was not always practical in rapid engagement scenarios. The weapon had to be laid on a surface, usually the ground, which meant that the shooter was in a prone position, which was useful for concealment, but limiting for mobility. The bipod at the front was generally robust, but the whole arrangement was clumsy enough in anything other than a carefully prepared firing position that maneuverability under fire was genuinely challenging. The bolt action required significant effort to cycle, and the 5-round magazine meant that reloading interruptions were frequent. None of this made the boys a beloved weapon among those who carried it. The nickname it accumulated among British and Commonwealth troops was not affectionate. They called it various things, most of them unprintable, and the more charitable assessments referred to it as clumsy, heavy, and awkward. The soldiers who operated it in the Western Desert had particularly colorful things to say about wrestling it in and out of jeeps and trucks, about the difficulty of setting it up quickly in the kind of fast-moving fluid situation that desert raiding involved, and about the bruising that accumulated over extended periods of regular use. And yet those same soldiers, the ones calling it heavy and awkward and various other things, were also the ones who recorded what it did to parked aircraft, to lightly armored vehicles, to field fortifications, and to anything softer than a main battle tank that had the misfortune of presenting itself as a target. The complaints were real. The capability was also real. Both things were true simultaneously, and understanding that duality is essential to understanding the boys. It was not a perfect weapon, it was not an elegant weapon, it was not a comfortable weapon, but it had a specific combination of characteristics, the velocity, the projectile, the penetration, and the range that made it genuinely useful in specific contexts, and those contexts turned out to be more varied than anyone had initially predicted. The ammunition story deserves its own section, because the boys' rifle went through several ammunition developments during its service life that significantly affected what it could and could not do. The original .55 caliber cartridge that boys designed the rifle around was a rimless case firing a steel cord bullet. This was the round that delivered those promising early penetration figures and made the weapon viable on paper against contemporary light armor. But as the war developed and it became clear that the anti-tank performance needed to be improved, or at minimum maintained against increasingly protected vehicles, British ordnance worked on ammunition upgrades. The tungsten carbide cord round, sometimes called the W Mark II in its various designations, was a significant development. Tungsten carbide is harder than steel, significantly harder. A projectile made with a tungsten carbide core maintains its shape better on impact with hard surfaces and transfers energy more efficiently through armor. The boys' rifle firing tungsten-cored ammunition showed meaningfully better penetration figures than the original steel-cored rounds. This wasn't a miracle transformation that made the boys competitive with German tanks again. The improvement wasn't that dramatic, but it was genuine, and it mattered in the context where the boys was still being used effectively. Against Japanese armor, against light vehicles, against aircraft and equipment, the tungsten round hit harder, penetrated more consistently, and caused more catastrophic damage on the far side of whatever it went through. The problem was supply. Tungsten carbide was a material in high demand for many military applications, and the boys' rifle was not the highest priority consumer of it. The tungsten-cored ammunition was available, but not always plentiful, and units using boys' rifles in the Pacific and elsewhere learned to manage their ammunition mix carefully, conserving the tungsten rounds for the situations where maximum penetration was genuinely needed. There were also armor-piercing incendiary variants developed, combining the penetration of the AP round with an incendiary element that could ignite fuel and cause fires in whatever the round passed through. Against aircraft particularly, this was a significant enhancement. A round that punched through a fuel tank and then set it on fire was substantially more destructive than a round that merely punched through it. The combination of penetration and incendiary effect made boys' rounds fired at parked aircraft genuinely devastating, and the Lurgig and SAS raiding parties in North Africa quickly recognized and exploited this capability. The cartridge itself, the .55 caliber boys' round, was also used in at least one experimental and semi-operational context that most histories completely ignore. There were attempts during the war to develop semi-automatic and even fully automatic weapons chambered in the boys' cartridge. The logic was straightforward. If a bolt-action rifle firing this round was useful against light targets, a weapon that could fire it faster would be more useful. Various experimental heavy machine gun and light cannon projects based around the boys' cartridge were tested, though none achieved significant production or service. The cartridge was also evaluated as a potential aircraft armament, where its velocity and penetration characteristics made it interesting for ground attack applications. None of these developments led anywhere particularly significant in the short term, but they demonstrate that the cartridge boys had designed was recognized as something worth building around even when the original rifle was being sidelined in the anti-tank role. The boys also served with forces beyond the British and Commonwealth armies, and some of those applications tell interesting stories about how other military thinking regarded the weapon's strengths and limitations. Canadian forces used the boys extensively, partly because Canadian industry was manufacturing the rifle, and partly because the specific combination of colonial territory, diverse terrain, and operational context meant that Canadian units in various theaters found uses for it that fit the weapon's actual capability profile. New Zealand and Australian forces were probably the most intensive Pacific users, and their tactical experience with the weapon against Japanese positions became a form of institutional knowledge that influenced how the rifle was employed in that theater through the middle years of the war. The Irish Army, which maintained neutrality but had to prepare for the possibility of invasion from either direction, acquired boys' rifles for their own defense forces. They recognized, as many smaller nations did, that the anti-tank rifle occupied a cost-effective niche. You couldn't afford tanks in large numbers if you were a small neutral nation, but you could afford anti-tank rifles, and if the armor you might face was light enough, those rifles were a credible deterrent. The Free French forces used boys' rifles in various campaigns, including in North Africa, where the desert conditions that made the weapon awkward for standard infantry were actually somewhat neutralized by the specific mobile operations that characterizes that theater. There are recorded instances of fighting French units employing boys' rifles against Italian vehicles in the desert fighting of 1941 and 1942, where the lighter Italian armor, generally less well protected than German equivalents, fell into the category of targets the boys could still defeat. The Soviets, through Lend-Lease arrangements, received some boys' rifles, though the quantities were not large and the Soviet assessment of the weapon was apparently that it was adequate but not particularly exciting compared to their own Parzian and PDR's anti-tank rifles, which they were already producing in large numbers and which used a different cartridge with somewhat different performance characteristics. The Soviets were also facing German armor even heavier than British forces were dealing with, which meant that any rifle-caliber anti-tank weapon was already in the category of last resort against the main threat. but for anti-aircraft use, for vehicle destruction, for the general utility missions that anti-tank rifles still served even after their primary purpose had been superseded, the Soviets found the boys workable. The anti-aircraft application of the boys is worth dwelling on, because it represents another example of the weapon-finding utility in a mission space that nobody originally designed it for and that turned out to be practically significant. Low-flying aircraft, particularly ground attack aircraft, dive bombers, and fighters strafing ground positions, were a constant threat to both sides throughout the Second World War. The standard response to low-flying aircraft from infantry was small arms fire, which was better than nothing, but was not a serious anti-aircraft measure against anything moving at several hundred miles per hour, with a pilot who had the option of staying high enough to be out of practical small arms range. The boys' rifle, with its high velocity and its ability to fire an armor-defeating round, occupied an interesting middle ground. It could reach altitudes and ranges that standard rifle fire couldn't usefully engage. It fired a round that, if it hit an aircraft, was not going to bounce off or cause minor damage. And it was vehicle or ground-mounted in most applications, which gave it stability that a soldier trying to aim a standard rifle at a fast-moving aircraft simply didn't have. Boys' rifles were mounted on vehicles as improvised anti-aircraft weapons throughout various campaigns. In the Western Desert, jeeps and trucks carrying boys' rifles with mounts adapted to allow high-angle fire were not uncommon. The Lurg in particular developed considerable improvised ingenuity in adapting their vehicles to carry weapons in configurations that standard doctrine hadn't anticipated. A boys' rifle on an improvised high-angle mount could put a steady stream of .55 caliber rounds in the general path of a low-flying aircraft with enough effect to force that aircraft to maneuver, increase altitude, or break off its attack run. You didn't need to guarantee a kill. Making the attack less accurate, forcing the pilot to think about his own survival, disrupting the steady diving run that made a bombing or strafing attack effective. These were tactically valuable outcomes even without a confirmed shoot-down. There were confirmed boys-attributed aircraft kills during the Second World War. The numbers are not large, and the documentation is often fragmentary in the way that improvised weapon use tends to be. But the principle was sound, and the practice was widespread enough that it clearly had tactical utility. Ground personnel, particularly those working on airstrips and supply depots that were regularly targeted by enemy aircraft, appreciated having something with more reach than a standard rifle when a fighter or dive bomber was making a strafing run. Now, one of the most overlooked chapters in the boys' story involves what happened to the weapon after its main service period ended, and how its design influenced what came later. Because the boys' anti-tank rifle did not simply disappear from the world stage when it was declared obsolete by the major Allied armies. It continued to serve in unexpected places for decades after the Second World War, and the design philosophy behind it, the large caliber, high-velocity, semi-portable anti-material rifle, turned out to be one of the most durable ideas in weapons development. The British themselves replaced the boys in the anti-tank role with the Piat, the projector infantry anti-tank, which used a completely different principle, the shaped charge, to defeat armor through a chemical rather than kinetic mechanism. The Piat had advantages against heavier armor that the boys could no longer claim. But it was not a replacement for every mission the boys had been performing. It couldn't shoot at aircraft effectively. It couldn't consistently penetrate bunker walls at range in the same direct-fire way. It wasn't suitable for the anti-material role that desert raiders had used the boys for. The boys and the Piat ended up serving simultaneously for a period, with units using each for the specific applications where its characteristics were most suited. This is itself an interesting commentary on how military weapons work in practice versus how they work in doctrine. Doctrine said the boys was obsolete and the Piat was its replacement. Reality said the boys was still doing specific things that the Piat didn't do, and both weapons continued to find use accordingly. After the Second World War, boys' rifles appeared in various conflicts around the world, wherever British military aid, surplus equipment sales, and colonial defense arrangements had spread British weapons. In the Malayan Emergency, in the early stages of the Korean War, where Commonwealth forces were involved, in various African independence conflicts, boys' rifles continued to see service in the hands of various parties. Their utility in post-war conflicts followed the same pattern as their wartime use. Against heavy armor, they were inadequate. Against light armor, fortifications, vehicles, and aircraft, they remained effective. The Korean War use is particularly interesting because it put the boys up against Soviet-supplied armor, including T-34 tanks that were significantly better protected than anything the boys had originally been designed to fight. Against the T-34's frontal armor, a boy's rifle was essentially pointless, but against the T-34's running gear and optics, against lighter North Korean vehicles and supply transport, against field fortifications and bunkers in the Korean terrain, boys' rifles in Commonwealth hands showed the same pattern they had shown in the Pacific. Limited against the main threat, genuinely useful against a range of subsidiary targets. The bigger legacy, though, is what the boys' rifle points toward in terms of weapon development. Because the concept of a large-caliber, high-velocity, man-portable rifle designed to defeat armor or light protection at range did not end with the boys. It evolved. The Browning M2 heavy machine gun had been around since 1933 and fired a .50 caliber cartridge that occupied similar territory in terms of capability. After the war, as the limitations of the boys' cartridge became increasingly apparent, the .50 caliber BMG round became the effective successor to that design philosophy in Western military use. But in the 1970s and 1980s, as irregular warfare became an increasingly central concern in military thinking, designers began revisiting the anti-material rifle concept with new eyes. If a relatively portable weapon could defeat light armor, disable vehicles, destroy aircraft on the ground, and engage point targets through cover at extended range, it had clear utility in the kind of special operations, guerrilla, and counterinsurgency warfare that was dominating the global security environment. The result was a new generation of large-caliber sniper rifles and anti-material rifles, the most famous of which is the Barrett M82 and its successors, chambered in .50 caliber BMG. These weapons do at modern range and with modern precision what the boys was trying to do in 1937. They disable vehicles at extreme range. They defeat light armor. They destroy parked aircraft and radar equipment and fuel storage. They punch through fortifications and cover that standard rifle rounds cannot defeat. They are, in direct conceptual lineage, the grandchildren of the boys' anti-tank rifle. The design philosophy that Captain H.C. Boys worked out in the early 1930s, the idea that a rifle-class weapon with a large, fast, hard projectile had legitimate military utility for missions that required punching through things rather than